On the sun-scorched plateaus of Iran, where desert winds roar against mountain walls like nature's own fortresses, a small tribe called the Parsa ignited a flame that would set history ablaze. From the thunder of nomadic horsemen's hooves, they forged an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean, swallowing mighty kingdoms and etching their name into legend. In this series, you will ride alongside Cyrus the Great, watching cities fall before the sun has fully risen. March with Darius along the royal road that pulsed like the empire's lifeblood. Hear the relentless war drums of the immortal warriors. Smell the smoke and blood at Marathon and Thermopylae. And finally witness Persepolis' last gleam fade beneath the hooves of Alexander the Great. This is a tale of power, ambition, and moments when the world itself held its breath. If you are ready for that journey, hit subscribe and like, because each coming chapter will pull you into the whirlpool where glory and ruin are separated by the swing of a single blade. The desert wind screamed across the barren Iranian plateau, carrying with it a haze of dust that turned the sunset into a blood-red haze. Against this backdrop, caravans of camels and horsemen stretched to the horizon, their silhouettes rippling like black banners in the dying light. There was no laughter in their ranks, no idle chatter, only the low, steady thump of war drums from somewhere beyond the ridge. Each beat in perfect rhythm with the pounding hearts of those who lived on this unforgiving land. This was the home of the Parsa, not yet a mighty empire, but a small tribe clinging to survival on the edge of the known world. In the early 6th century BCE, the Parsa were one among many scattered peoples across the Iranian plateau. They had no towering city walls, no bustling seaports, and no armies that could rival the great powers of their age. What they did have was something harder to measure: a will forged in hardship, and an ambition that burned brighter than the desert sun. Life here was a constant struggle. Summers were merciless, the heat shimmering in waves across the cracked earth. Winters brought biting winds that tore through clothing and bone alike. Between these extremes, the Parsa herded their animals, traded with passing caravans, and sharpened their weapons, always ready for the next raid, whether as hunter or hunted. They knew that alliances could shift overnight, that a feast today could turn into famine tomorrow. In such a world, trust was rare, but loyalty, once earned, was unbreakable. Yet geography was both their greatest challenge and their greatest asset. The Iranian plateau was a crossroads between worlds. To the east lay the riches of India. To the west, the cities of Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. Traders, migrants, and conquerors all passed through these lands, leaving behind fragments of language, culture, and knowledge. The Parsa, perhaps without realizing it, were standing at the intersection of history itself. Whoever controlled this plateau could command the lifelines of trade and war between East and West. It is tempting to imagine the Parsa as backward nomads compared to the polished civilizations of Babylon or Lydia. But that would be a mistake. While their tents and camps lacked the grandeur of marble palaces, their society was lean, adaptable, and disciplined, where a great city might crumble if its supply lines were cut. The Parsa could vanish into the hills, survive on what the land gave them, and return to fight another day. In modern gaming terms, if you've ever played Age of Empires Dadeku, the Persians start slowly, almost vulnerable in the early game. But if you survive the first waves of hardship, the late-game payoff is devastating. The Parsa's real history wasn't so different. For decades, they weathered stronger neighbors, learned from their enemies, and waited for their chance to strike. That chance came when the tribes began to unite. In a time when betrayal was as common as breathing, The Parsa found leaders who could inspire loyalty beyond blood ties. Tribal chiefs began meeting under banners instead of behind spears. Small alliances grew into coalitions. Raids became coordinated campaigns. For the first time, there was the faint outline of something greater than mere survival, something that could last. From the scattered camps and windswept plains, a single name began to emerge. A leader whose vision went beyond the next raid or the next season's pasture. His presence was magnetic. Warriors followed him without hesitation. Elders listened to him without suspicion. He had the cunning of a raider, the patience of a shepherd, and the mind of a strategist. Under his guidance, the Parsa began to think not just as a tribe, but as a people with a destiny. History would remember him as Cyrus, though in this moment he was not yet the Great. His legend was still being written, each choice he made pulling the Parsa further from the margins of history and closer to its center. In the years to come, this man would lead the Parsa out of obscurity, challenge empires that had stood for centuries, and carve out a realm that would stretch across 3 continents. But that is the next chapter of our story. For now, imagine the scene. The campfires of the Parsa flicker in the cold desert night, their smoke curling into a sky thick with stars. Somewhere, the young Cyrus is speaking quietly with his most trusted allies, laying out plans that will change the fate of nations. The war drums that began the day still echo faintly in the distance. But tonight, they sound less like a warning and more like a promise. Because in the heart of the desert, the seed of an empire has just been planted. Next, Chapter 2, Cyrus the Great, father of an empire. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the Iranian plateau in gold. At the head of his army, Cyrus rode in silence, the sound of hooves muffled by the desert sand. His eyes were fixed far ahead, toward lands that most of his warriors had only heard about in campfire tales. Rich kingdoms like Lydia, whose gold could buy the loyalty of 1,000 mercenaries. And Babylon, a city so legendary that even its walls were said to touch the heavens. Cyrus was not yet the ruler of an empire, but he carried himself as if the future already belonged to him. In 547 BCE, Cyrus made his first great gamble, the conquest of Lydia. The Lydian king, Croesus, was wealthy beyond imagination, his treasury overflowing with the spoils of decades of trade and conquest. Croesus underestimated the Parsa chieftain, thinking Cyrus would crumble against Lydia's disciplined armies and war chariots. Instead, Cyrus used a combination of speed, deception, and relentless pursuit to break the Lydians. The final blow came at Sardis, where Cyrus captured the city and its ruler, alive. It was a message to the world. The Parsa had arrived, and they were led by a man who understood both war and mercy. Mercy was, in fact, Cyrus's signature weapon. After Lydia, he turned his gaze toward Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. By then, the Babylonian Empire was rotting from within. Corruption, religious tensions, and unpopular rulers had left the city vulnerable. Most conquerors would have stormed the gates, looted the temples, and enslaved the people. Cyrus took another path. In 539 BCE, he entered Babylon not with fire and sword, but with open hands. His army marched in without spilling blood, a feat almost unheard of in ancient warfare. Picture the moment. The massive Ishtar gate towering above, glazed bricks gleaming in the late afternoon light. The streets, eerily silent, lined with Babylonian citizens holding their breath. And then, slow motion, the tall figure of Cyrus, clad in armor burnished from 100 campaigns, rides through the gate. He doesn't raise his sword in triumph. Instead, he raises his open palm in peace. The crowd exhales, not in fear, but in cautious relief. This was conquest without chains. AOE2 fans might imagine the rare game where you win not by total destruction, but by diplomacy and economy. This policy of respect and integration became the foundation of the Persian Empire. Cyrus allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs, languages, and religions. The Jews, exiled in Babylon, were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a gesture that earned Cyrus lasting reverence in biblical history. By blending military strength with political tolerance, he created an empire that was not just vast, but stable. Yet this stability came at a cost. It relied heavily on his personal authority and the loyalty he inspired. Without him, could the system hold? His military brilliance was undeniable. Cyrus moved his forces with a precision that seemed almost modern, using terrain, speed, and intelligence networks to outmaneuver enemies. He could strike hard when needed, but also knew when restraint served his goals better. In Age of Empires, the Seku terms, the Persians under Cyrus weren't just charging into battle. They were building a booming economy behind the scenes, ready to unleash powerful cavalry and siege engines when the time was right. It was long-term thinking on a grand scale. But empires are never built without risk. Each new conquest stretched his resources further. Each alliance demanded careful balancing. One wrong decision could spark rebellion in the provinces or invite an attack from a rival power. Cyrus's genius lay in making it look effortless. So effortless that future rulers would underestimate how much work it took to keep the empire from cracking. His enemies feared him not only for his armies, but for the way he could turn yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's loyal ally. In the end, Cyrus's reign was not defined solely by the lands he conquered, but by the world he shaped. He transformed the Parsa from a small tribe into the core of an empire that spanned 3 continents. His vision set the stage for a network of roads, cities, and trade routes that would connect the ancient world in ways no one had imagined before. But as with all great leaders, his death would leave a question hanging in the air. Who could possibly follow in his footsteps? That question will lead us directly to the next chapter of our story. A chapter where a new ruler must prove that the empire's foundation was strong enough to outlast its founder. The world would soon meet Darius I, the man who would take Cyrus's vision and etch it into stone and road. But as we'll see, the road to glory is never a straight one. The sun blazed over the Iranian plateau, casting long shadows from the endless columns of horsemen and merchants moving in both directions. Hooves and wheels kicked up clouds of dust, but the dust could not dim the brilliance of the polished bronze helmets, the glint of silver breastplates, and the vibrant silks fluttering in the wind. From a bird's-eye view, it looked like a living river, stretching beyond the horizon. This was no ordinary road. It was the spine of an empire. When Cyrus the Great passed from the world, the question of succession was anything but smooth. Power struggles erupted, and for a moment, the empire seemed poised to fracture. But then came Darius I, not a direct heir, but a man of noble blood and unshakable resolve. Through calculated force and political skill, he secured the throne. Yet Darius knew that conquering a crown was only the first step. The real challenge was to rule an empire too vast for any one man to see in a lifetime. To hold it together, Darius reshaped Persia's administration into a model the ancient world had never seen. He divided the empire into satrapies, provinces each governed by a satrap, or protector of the kingdom. These satraps acted as the king's eyes and hands in distant lands, responsible for collecting tribute maintaining order and defending borders. To prevent any satrap from becoming too powerful, Darius sent royal inspectors, the king's eyes, to keep them in check. It was a delicate balance of trust and suspicion, a system that could make the empire run like a well-oiled war machine, or collapse into chaos if abused. But perhaps Darius's most enduring legacy was a marvel of engineering and vision: the Royal Road. Spanning nearly 1,700 miles from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in the Persian heartland, this highway connected the farthest corners of the empire. Along its length, relay stations housed fresh horses, allowing royal messengers to carry news across the empire in mere days, a feat that stunned the ancient world. What once took months could now be done in a week. Information flowed faster than rebellion could spread, and trade boomed like never before. Imagine a camera sweeping along the Royal Road. Caravans laden with spices and jewels pass armored squadrons, their polished scale armor catching the sunlight. Merchants haggle in half a dozen languages. Soldiers share bread with travelers from lands they had once conquered. Every mile hums with life. The road was more than stone and dust. It was the empire's lifeblood, the artery through which power, culture, and wealth flowed. The economic surge was staggering. Markets in Egypt suddenly had access to horses from Bactria. Artisans in Lydia could trade their finely worked gold for rare Indian ivory. For the Persians, this was like unlocking the imperial age, early an age of empires that skew. Resources poured in faster, armies could be supplied farther, and the empire's reach felt limitless. Darius had turned geography into strategy, and strategy into dominance. Yet the system had its cracks. The satraps, distant from the royal court, sometimes acted as kings in all but name, hoarding taxes or plotting rebellion. The royal road that could bring troops to crush a revolt could just as easily carry news of dissent faster than ever before. The same speed that empowered the king also empowered those who opposed him. Darius's genius was in staying one step ahead, using diplomacy, intimidation, and swift retribution to keep the empire intact. Under his reign, the Persian Empire reached a level of stability and prosperity that was the envy of the world. Roads, coinage, legal codes, all standardized under a single vision. It was a golden age, not of peace, but of controlled power. And yet, history teaches us that no system is invincible. Even in this era of apparent unshakable strength, threats gathered on the horizon. For beyond the shining markets and well-guarded highways, there were warriors being trained. Warriors who would come to embody the very soul of Persia's military might. They were the king's chosen, a force whose name alone inspired fear from Egypt to the Aegean. They were called the Immortals. The first thing you noticed wasn't the sound. It was the glint. A shimmer on the horizon, like the surface of a restless sea under the midday sun. As the shapes grew larger, the shimmer became thousands of overlapping scales, bronze, silver, and gold, catching the light with every step. Then came the sound, the deep, steady boom of war drums, a rhythm so precise it could have been the empire's heartbeat. The Immortals were coming. They were the elite of the Persian military, a standing force of exactly 10,000 men, never more, never less. If one fell in battle, another immediately took his place. To friend and foe alike, it seemed they could not die. Their numbers never diminished. The name was not just a title, it was a psychological weapon. In a world where rumors traveled faster than armies, the idea of an unkillable legion was worth as much as any fortress. Their armor was both protection and spectacle. long tunics embroidered with intricate patterns, soft leather boots for silent marches, and scale armor that rippled like fish in a sunlit river. Each carried a short spear, a bow of composite wood, and a quiver of arrows tipped in iron. At their sides hung short swords, the last whisper of death for any enemy who came too close. But it wasn't their weapons that broke enemy lines, it was their unity. The Immortals moved as one organism, a wall of shields and points, advancing without hesitation, without fear. In the heat of battle, they were a machine. When their archers unleashed volleys, it was not a scatter of arrows, it was a single, sweeping wave of death. When they marched forward, the sound was not of men walking, but of the earth itself shifting under their weight. Their discipline was absolute. Orders from the king were obeyed without pause, even if it meant certain death. The cost of such perfection was high. Maintaining a constant force of 10,000 required endless training, supply, and recruitment. The Empire poured gold and grain into the Immortals, knowing that their presence on the battlefield was as much about fear as about actual combat power. Armies twice their size had faltered simply at the sight of them. From a military strategy standpoint, the Immortals were more than soldiers. They were the Empire's statement. Sending them into a campaign was a declaration that the king himself was invested in the outcome. To face the Immortals was to face Persia's will, made flesh. In an age of empires, the Seku terms, they were the late-game Persian power spike. Not necessarily the fastest or flashiest, but when they arrived, their sheer weight and resilience crushed opposition. Think of them like Persian war elephants paired with elite cavalry. Slower than some units, yes, but relentless, grinding through defenses until nothing remained. One famous account describes their arrival at a rebellious province in the Empire's far reaches. The local chieftains had expected a punitive raid, maybe a show of force by a few hundred soldiers. Instead, they saw the full might of the Immortals descend upon their gates. The battle didn't last a day. It didn't need to. The sight of that unbroken wall advancing under the royal standard was enough to shatter resistance before the first spear was thrown. But their reputation also came with limits. In tight mountain passes or marshy terrain, the Immortals' tight formations could be slowed or disrupted against enemies who refused to meet them head-on, skirmishers who melted into the hills after each strike. Their psychological edge meant less. Maintaining their numbers meant constant recruitment from across the Empire, and not every replacement lived up to the legendary standard. Even so, the idea of the Immortals persisted, outliving individual men and even individual kings. One of the most striking things about the Immortals was their role beyond the battlefield. They were the king's ceremonial guard, the gleaming backdrop to royal audiences, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. Foreign envoys arriving at Persepolis would be escorted past rows of Immortals, each standing perfectly still, eyes forward, armor polished to a mirror shine. It sent an unspoken message. The same men who guard the king's throne can also take your city by nightfall. Still, the true test of the Immortals was yet to come. For all their victories in the east and within the Empire's heartlands, a new challenge was brewing far to the west. Across the Aegean Sea lay a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, small compared to Persia, but stubborn, inventive, and dangerous. The Greeks were not impressed by the empire's size or its gold. They fought for their own freedoms with a ferocity that no army, not even the Immortals, could dismiss. And so, the Immortals would march again, this time not against scattered rebels or outmatched neighbors, but into battles that would be sung about for thousands of years. On the plains of Marathon, in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, The world would see whether the legend of the immortals could withstand the reality of war against an enemy that refused to be broken. The horizon was already darkening with storm clouds from the west. The king's orders were clear. The immortals would lead the way. The air was thick with the smell of brine and sweat. From the decks of Persian warships, the coastline of Greece looked like the edge of the known world, a jagged horizon where the land rose defiantly from the sea. The great kings of Persia had commanded armies across deserts, mountains, and fertile plains. But here they faced something different. A scattering of fiercely independent city-states bound not by empire, but by an unshakable pride in their freedom. The First Greco-Persian War began with a simple intention: to bring these defiant lands into the fold of the empire. For Darius the Therfiners, it was both a matter of expansion and of honor. The Athenians had dared to aid the Ionian revolt years earlier, burning the Persian city of Sardis in the process. Such an insult could not go unanswered. The Persian fleet landed at Marathon in 490 BCE. The flat beach stretching inland into low hills, a battlefield that seemed to favor the Persian way of war. The numbers were on Persia's side. Tens of thousands of soldiers, including cavalry and archers, against roughly 10,000 Athenian and Plataean hoplites. The Persian commanders expected an easy victory, the kind that would send a message to all of Greece. But Marathon did not go as planned. The Athenians, armed with heavy bronze armor and long spears, advanced at a run, closing the distance before Persian archers could fully unleash their devastating volleys. The narrow battlefield nullified the cavalry's maneuverability, and the sheer weight of the Greek phalanx smashed into Persian lines like a living wall. Hours later, the beach was littered with the dead. Persian soldiers withdrew to their ships, shocked not just by defeat, but by the realization that these Greeks would not be easily subdued. Marathon was a wound to the empire's pride, but not a mortal one. Plans began almost immediately for a second invasion, larger, more decisive. When Xerxes, son of Darius, took the throne, he inherited both the resources and the determination to finish what his father had started. This time, Persia would bring an army so massive it would shake the earth. By 480 BCE, the Persian war machine was in motion. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from every corner of the empire. Warships by the hundreds, supply lines stretching across the Aegean like veins feeding a giant. The Greeks, knowing they could not match such numbers in open battle, chose to make their stand in places where Persian strength would be blunted by the terrain. Which brings us to Thermopylae. Imagine a narrow pass between steep mountains and the sea, so tight that only a few dozen men could fight side by side. This was where a small coalition of Greek forces, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, chose to face the Persian advance. The plan was simple: hold the pass long enough for the rest of Greece to prepare. The Persians arrived like a tide. Their archers darkened the sky with arrows, thousands at a time, turning daylight into shadow. The sound was like 1,000 sheets of cloth tearing at once. Against any ordinary enemy, it would have been enough to break the line. But the Spartans and their allies raised their shields and stood unmoved, the arrows thudding harmlessly against bronze. The fighting at Thermopylae was brutal and intimate. Persian infantry surged forward, only to be pushed back by the impenetrable Greek phalanx. The immortals themselves were sent into the fray, their disciplined ranks meeting the equally disciplined Spartan wall. For 2 days, the pass held. Xerxes watched, growing frustrated, as wave after wave failed to break through. It was not superior force that won the pass for Persia. It was betrayal. A local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a hidden path through the mountains, allowing Persian forces to flank the defenders. Leonidas and his small band of Spartans, along with a few hundred Thespians and Thebans, fought to the last man, buying precious time for the rest of Greece to rally. Thermopylae was, in military terms, a Persian victory. The pass was taken, and the road to Athens lay open. But it was also a reminder that sheer numbers could be blunted by terrain, strategy, and willpower. The Greek resistance turned the battle into a legend, inspiring their people to fight on. From a strategic standpoint, the Persian strengths were clear. Overwhelming manpower, a diverse army drawn from across the empire, and unmatched logistical capabilities. But the weaknesses were equally clear. Against enemies who refused to meet them in open fields, who used the land itself as a weapon, Persian forces struggled to adapt. Terrain, weather, and guerrilla tactics could all chip away at the empire's advantage. In Age of Empires, the Seku terms, it was like the Persian civilization facing an opponent with a long-range bonus, say, Britons with their deadly archers. Persia's cavalry and elephants were powerful, but on narrow maps or against players who used choke points, that power could be neutralized. Without flexibility, even the mightiest force could be stalled. The clash between Persia and Greece was more than just a military conflict. It was a meeting of two different worlds. Persia fought to expand an empire built on unity through diversity, a centralized authority ruling over many peoples. Greece fought to preserve the independence of its small, often quarrelsome city-states. Each side believed it was defending something worth dying for. The road ahead would see more battles, Salamis on the sea, Plataea on the plains. But Marathon and Thermopylae would remain etched in history as moments when the unstoppable force of Persia met the immovable will of Greece. For Persia, the wars were not the end. Even in defeat, the empire remained vast, wealthy, and powerful. But the Greeks had shown the world that it was possible to resist the great king and win. The echoes of those battles would shape the politics, strategy, and legends of both civilizations for centuries to come. And back in the east, far from the smoke and blood of the Greek front, the heart of the empire still beat strong. In Persepolis, the crown jewel of Persian architecture, the king was already dreaming of a different kind of conquest, not of land, but of legacy. The night sky over Persepolis glowed like a second dawn. Torches blazed along the great processional staircases, their flames flickering against polished stone walls carved with scenes of kings, warriors, and lions locked in eternal combat. Music drifted on the desert wind, flutes, lyres, and the deep pulse of drums, announcing a celebration worthy of the largest empire on earth. In the heart of the city, the grand hall of 100 columns was alive with color and sound. Gold and silver vessels caught the light of hundreds of braziers, scattering it in 1,000 directions. Long silk banners, dyed in indigo, crimson, and emerald, hung from cedar beams imported from distant Lebanon. The scent of roasted lamb, saffron rice, and honeyed dates filled the air, mingling with a sharper aroma of burning frankincense. This was no ordinary feast. It was the Nowruz, the Persian New Year, and the city itself was the guest of honor. At the center of it all sat the King of Kings, his high throne placed upon a platform so that all could see the man who ruled from the Nile to the Indus. His robes shimmered with gold thread, his crown adorned with precious stones gathered from every corner of his dominion. Persepolis was not just a capital. It was a statement carved into the very earth. Conceived during the reign of Darius the First and expanded by his successors, it was both fortress and palace, treasury and temple. Built on a massive stone terrace, the city commanded the plain below, visible for miles. Anyone approaching could not help but feel its gravity, the weight of an empire that had gathered the world's wealth and artistry into one place. That night's banquet was as much diplomacy as it was celebration. Envoys from Egypt carried lapis lazuli and ivory. Emissaries from India brought spices and rare woods. Greek representatives, some allies, some rivals, offered finely wrought silverwork. They filed in along the great staircases, flanked by carved reliefs depicting their very act of tribute, as though time had folded in on itself. One could imagine the scene as a strategy from Age of Empires 2, pouring every resource into constructing a wonder. The city was exactly that, a wonder in stone, marble, and gold. It projected awe and dominance, sending a message across the empire. Persia was eternal, its culture unassailable. But like in the game, the risk was clear. A wonder drew the eyes of the world. But if the empire failed to defend it, all that grandeur could crumble in a single blow. The artistic achievements of Persepolis rivaled its political significance. Its walls were adorned with intricate bas-reliefs telling the story of the empire. Delegations from distant lands, scenes of royal hunts, mythical beasts symbolizing strength and authority. Columns rose like forests, turned to stone, their capitals carved into the shapes of bulls, lions, and griffins, each a silent guardian of the throne. Scholars and artisans from across the empire flocked to Persepolis. Here, Babylonian scribes worked alongside Greek sculptors, Egyptian masons shared techniques with craftsmen from Anatolia. It was a fusion of styles that created something uniquely Persian, an artistic language that spoke of unity through diversity. But beneath the gold and marble, there were whispers. Some in the military muttered that too much treasure was being spent on pageantry instead of fortifications. Provincial governors, satraps, grumbled about the heavy levies needed to fund the city's endless construction and lavish festivals. Traders complained that their caravans were being delayed by the constant influx of laborers and materials to Persepolis, disrupting commerce. The King of Kings, however, understood the deeper power of the city. Military victories won borders. Cultural victories won hearts. An enemy might resist your army, but it was harder to resist the pull of beauty, wealth, and prestige. Persepolis was meant to be more than the empire's brain. It was its beating heart, the place where all roads of politics, art, and religion converged. Still, history is unkind to monuments built at the height of power. When an empire reaches its zenith, it often cannot see the shadow growing just beyond its light. For Persia, that shadow lay across the Aegean Sea, where Greek city-states nursed old grudges and plotted new alliances. Even as Persepolis dazzled guests with its gold and feasts, fleets were being built in secret harbors. Strategies whispered in marble halls far from the desert sun. On that night of firelight and music, no one in the grand hall could imagine that one day, flames would consume these very columns, melting the gold, blackening the walls, and scattering the treasures to the winds. For now the king raised his golden cup, and the hall echoed with the voices of 100 nations toasting his reign. Outside, the wind carried the sound of laughter and music across the plateau. The torches burned bright against the night, but in the distance, far beyond the reach of their light, waves crashed against the shores of Greece. The next great chapter of Persia's story would not be written in the language of marble and gold, but in the language of war, and on the waters where the empire's strength would face its greatest test. The feast would end, the music would fade, and the ships would sail. The morning of the battle began with a deceptive calm. The waters of the Saronic Gulf lay still, reflecting the pale light of dawn like a sheet of hammered bronze. In the distance, the Greek coastline formed a jagged silhouette against the rising sun. From the deck of a Persian trireme, the smell of salt and tar mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from the enemy shore. The men stood ready, oars poised, eyes fixed on the narrow straits ahead. Xerxes, king of kings, watched from a golden throne placed on a hill overlooking the sea. His confidence was unshaken. After all, his armies had crushed resistance on land, and Athens itself had already been burned. The Greek fleet, outnumbered and cornered at Salamis, seemed ready to break. Victory appeared inevitable. But the sea, unlike the battlefield, has its own rules. The Persian navy, massive but unwieldy, was designed for speed on open waters, not for the knife fight of maneuvering through cramped straits. Many of its sailors were levied from inland provinces with little naval tradition, brave soldiers, but not bred to read the currents and winds the way the Greeks were. By contrast, the Greek fleet, though smaller, was forged from the experience of a people who lived by the sea. When the signal came, the Persian fleet advanced into the narrowing channel. At first, the oar strokes were in perfect rhythm, hundreds of ships moving as one, their bronze rams gleaming beneath the waves. Then the shouting began. Confused orders, the crash of hull against hull as the front line slowed and those behind could not halt in time. The neat formation dissolved into chaos. That was when the Greeks struck. From the shadows between the islands, the Greek triremes surged forward, their crews driving them with a precision born of generations at sea. The sound came first, a deep, splintering crack as bronze beaks smashed into Persian hulls. Water rushed in, men screamed as decks tilted, pitching them into the cold embrace of the sea. Above it all, the war cries of the Greeks echoed off the cliffs, a wall of sound that seemed to close in as surely as their ships did. The air turned black with smoke as fire arrows found their marks. Flames licked along the decks, feeding on the tarred ropes and drying timbers. The smell of burning pine filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of salt water and the iron scent of blood. All around, the sea was alive with struggling men. Broken masts and the wreckage of an empire's pride. From his vantage point, Xerxes saw the disaster unfolding below. He had expected to watch a victory worthy of the great kings of old. Instead, he watched his ships die in the straits like trapped animals. Each sinking vessel was another blow to the illusion of Persian invincibility. The Persians fought bravely, but bravery could not overcome physics and experience. Their oars were too long for such tight maneuvers. Their decks too crowded with soldiers expecting to board the enemy rather than outpace them. Greek captains, knowing every eddy and current, danced through the chaos, striking and retreating before the Persians could turn. By midday, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The once mighty Persian fleet was shattered. Survivors clung to debris or swam desperately toward the shore, where enemy archers waited. Xerxes, grim-faced, gave the order to withdraw. The sea, moments ago a flat sheet of bronze, was now a graveyard of charred timbers and silent oars. In Age of Empires, the Seku terms, it was as if the Persian player had poured resources into elite cavalry and siege engines, only to be drawn onto a water map against a foe with fully upgraded galleons and superior micro. On land, Persia was a juggernaut. At sea, it was an empire out of its depth, literally. The weakness of its navy had been exposed in brutal clarity, and no amount of gold could turn the tide once the current favored the Greeks. The defeat at Salamis was more than just the loss of ships. it shattered the momentum of the Persian campaign. Without control of the sea, supplying the massive land army became a nightmare. Grain, weapons, reinforcements, all moved slower, cost more, and risked interception by the enemy. What had been a relentless advance now became a slow retreat. For the Greeks, the victory was more than survival. It was a rallying cry. They had faced the largest empire the world had ever seen. And in the narrow straits, they had found a way to win. Stories of the battle spread like wildfire across the Aegean, inspiring allies and sowing doubt among Persian subjects. For Persia, Salamis was a wound to its pride, a reminder that no empire is invincible. The King of Kings had to return home, leaving behind generals to continue the fight. But the grand vision of total conquest had been broken. The loss also marked the beginning of a subtle shift, away from constant expansion and toward defending what was already held. Yet, in the halls of Persepolis and Susa, the memory of the defeat was often softened. Chroniclers spoke of storms, of treachery, of the gods favoring the Greeks. But those who had stood on the decks that day knew the truth. It had not been the gods that won, but skill, preparation, and the choice of battlefield. And so the empire turned inward. The glories of expansion began to fade, replaced by the quieter task of preservation. The story of Persia was not over, but the chapter of unbroken triumph had closed. Far to the east, caravans still carried gold and silk to the heart of the empire. In the royal courts, music still played and wine still flowed. But for those who had seen the waters of Salamis, the sound of waves against the hull would forever carry an undertone of loss. The throne room in Persepolis no longer carried the same hum of confidence it once had. Where once envoys from distant lands had knelt, bearing gifts of gold and incense, now the messengers came with bowed heads and bad news. The war drums that had once beaten a steady rhythm of conquest were silent, replaced by whispers of rebellion, corruption, and defeat. In a dimly lit war council, the empire's generals stood around a scarred wooden table. Flickering torchlight cast long shadows across their faces, illuminating the cracks in their unity. Spread before them was a massive map, creases worn thin from years of handling, its edges torn and curling. New marks had been inked in crimson. Enemy incursions, lost provinces, uprisings in the satrapies. "What do you propose we defend first?" one general barked, his voice sharp with frustration. "The north. If we lose those provinces, the grain shipments will be cut," another replied. "And what of the west? Do you wish to hand it to our enemies without a fight?" A third snapped. The voices rose, clashing like swords. No consensus, only accusations. The unity that had carried Persia to its zenith under Darius and Xerxes was gone, replaced by mistrust and political maneuvering. Outside the council chamber, the court was no better. Satraps enriching themselves, levying heavier taxes to fund their own luxuries, while their soldiers went unpaid. Corruption seeped into the lifeblood of the empire. Provincial governors, once loyal administrators, began acting as kings in all but name. Tribute shipments arrived late, if at all. Roads that had once been patrolled and safe for merchants now teemed with bandits. In distant territories, the empire's banner still flew, but the loyalty it commanded was thin as parchment. Then came the rebellions. Egypt, always a proud and restive satrapy, rose again, expelling Persian garrisons. And in the far reaches of Asia Minor, Greek cities plotted with old rivals. Even in the heartland, discontent festered. Armies that had once marched in perfect formation now hesitated, their morale sapped by years of inconclusive campaigns and the knowledge that their pay was uncertain. News of military failure spread like wildfire. A campaign to subdue the Scythians ended in disaster, the troops returning battered and demoralized. Efforts to reclaim rebellious provinces faltered, either bogged down in endless skirmishes or collapsing under the weight of poor supply lines. Each loss chipped away at the empire's image of invincibility. The Persian army was still formidable, but its enemies had learned. The Greeks, once divided, began forging alliances. The Egyptians sought foreign aid. Even small kingdoms on the periphery sensed an opportunity, striking at border garrisons or refusing tribute. In Age of Empires, the Sekou terms, Persia had lost its eco-lead. For decades, it had been the player with the strongest economy, gold mines overflowing, trade routes thriving, resources to spare for war. But now, the steady stream of income had been interrupted. Farms lay idle, trade carts were raided, and expensive military units drained the treasury without decisive victories. Meanwhile, the opponents, leaner, hungrier, were building momentum, pushing the once mighty empire into a defensive crouch. The royal treasury still gleamed with gold, but it was an illusion of strength. Much of it was already pledged to mercenaries, to allies who demanded payment before they would fight, to rebuilding cities destroyed by war. For the first time in living memory, Persia had to choose which fronts to defend, knowing others would be lost. In the candlelit corridors of Persepolis, the air was heavy with unease. Servants spoke in hushed tones of omens, of cracks appearing in palace walls, of sudden storms and failed harvests. Scholars debated whether the empire's decline was the will of the gods or the fault of men. Poets, once commissioned to sing of victory, now penned verses mourning a golden age slipping into shadow. The king, cloaked in ceremonial splendor, still projected the image of command. But behind closed doors, even he knew the truth. The empire was overextended. Its strength stretched thin across too many borders. Victory no longer seemed certain. It had become a gamble. Each campaign a roll of the dice with higher stakes and fewer resources. And in the west, across the restless Aegean, a new storm was brewing. A young king had risen in Macedonia, a man whose ambition was matched only by his military genius. His name was beginning to circulate in whispers among the Persian court, though most still dismissed him as just another Greek warlord. They had said the same about many before him. But in the dim light of the war council, one old general traced a finger over the western edge of the map and muttered, "If we do not put our house in order, this Alexander will bring the storm to our gates." The others ignored him, too busy arguing over troop allocations and tax levies. Outside, the torches guttered in the wind, casting fleeting shadows that danced over the battered map, a map that, for the first time in centuries, no longer looked eternal. The empire still stood, its palaces still glittered, and its armies could still march in splendid ranks. But the foundation was crumbling. The world had begun to see Persia not as an unstoppable force, but as a giant swaying under its own weight, vulnerable to a hard enough push. That push was coming. The dawn over the plains of Gaugamela was cold and sharp, the kind of morning that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. On the horizon, the Persian army stretched in a vast line, tens of thousands of men, the greatest force the empire could still muster. Chariots bristling with scythe blades, cavalry armored in silver and gold, ranks upon ranks of spearmen glinting under the rising sun. In the center, the great king sat upon a tall chariot, banners of royal purple and gold snapping in the wind. This was to be the battle that would erase the shame of past defeats and restore Persia's dominance. But across the field, the Macedonian army waited. Smaller, tighter, every formation drilled to perfection. At their head was Alexander, just 25 years old, eyes fixed on the horizon with a predator's focus. The stories had already begun to spread, that he was invincible in battle, that he had never lost a fight, that the gods themselves walked beside him. The ground between the two armies shimmered in the early light. Then, silence broke. The Macedonian cavalry moved first, a disciplined surge that ate up the distance with terrifying speed. The Persians countered, sending their own cavalry to meet the threat. From a distance, it was a blur of motion, until the moment the two lines collided. In that instant, time seemed to slow. Spears shattered, shields buckled, and the polished points of lances flashed like lightning. Alexander himself led the companion cavalry, driving straight at the heart of the Persian lines. His wedge formation punched through like an arrowhead, the narrow tip cutting deep before the wider base ripped the gap wide open. Persian soldiers fought fiercely, clashing swords, shouting war cries. But their formations wavered under the precision of the Macedonian assault. On the flanks, the disciplined Macedonian infantry advanced methodically. Their sarissas, long spears nearly twice the length of Persian weapons, keeping enemy troops at bay. The royal chariot maneuvered desperately, trying to rally the lines. But the Persian command structure was too rigid, too slow to adapt. Orders were shouted, runners dispatched. But by the time commands reached the front, the situation had already shifted. Then Alexander made his move. Spotting a gap in the Persian center, just wide enough, he wheeled his cavalry and drove straight for it. Dust and screams filled the air as the charge tore through the heart of the Persian army, scattering men like leaves before a storm. The great king saw the breach. In that moment, survival outweighed glory. Turning his chariot, he fled the field, hoping to regroup elsewhere. But with their king gone, the Persian lines dissolved. Discipline broke. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. What had been a battle became a rout. By sunset, the field of Gaugamela was silent except for the groans of the wounded. The Macedonian banners stood where the Persian royal standard had once flown. The empire's might, centuries in the making, had been broken in a single day. In Age of Empires the Sigu terms, it was the perfect fast castle plus timing push. Persia, still trying to recover its economy and reform its armies, had been caught before it could adapt. Alexander had hit at the exact moment when the empire's weaknesses were exposed. Outdated tactics, slow command chains, over-reliance on sheer numbers instead of flexibility. By the time Persia realized it needed to change, the enemy was already at the gates. In the weeks that followed, city after city fell. Babylon surrendered. Susa opened its gates without a fight. Even the jewel of the empire, Persepolis, would not be spared. Its treasures seized, its halls set ablaze in a fire that lit the night sky for miles. Some Persians fought on, waging guerrilla campaigns in the mountains. But the heart of the empire was gone. Alexander pressed forward relentlessly, taking not just territory, but legitimacy. He proclaimed himself the rightful ruler of Asia, wearing Persian robes, adopting Persian court customs, and binding the empire's remaining elite to his cause. For the people of Persia, it was a bewildering transformation. The great king had been the center of their world. Now, that role belonged to a foreign conqueror who fought like a storm and ruled like he had been born to it. The Achaemenid Empire, which had once stretched from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean, collapsed with shocking speed. Not with a slow decay into irrelevance, but with the crash of a great tree felled in a single blow. Gaugamela was more than a battle. It was the moment the ancient world shifted, when the old order gave way to the new. For Persia, it was the end of glory. For Alexander, it was only the beginning. The sun dips low over the ruins of Persepolis, casting long shadows across the shattered columns and silent courtyards. The wind whistles through the broken archways like an ancient voice, carrying whispers of a world that once stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. Here, among the scattered stones, the spirit of the Persian Empire still lingers, not as a ghost of defeat, but as a reminder of a civilization whose vision stretched beyond borders, beyond centuries. Centuries earlier, Persepolis was no graveyard of stone, but a living jewel. The grand staircases bustled with envoys from every corner of the empire, from the Nile Delta to the Indus Valley. They came bearing gifts: gold from Lydia, lapis lazuli from Bactria, silk from the east. In the great audience hall, massive cedar doors opened to reveal King Darius, or Xerxes, seated upon a throne of ivory and gold, surrounded by immortal guards whose spears shimmered under torchlight. It was more than a city. It was a statement to the world. This is Persia. This is order. This is power. Yet, the Persian legacy is not defined solely by military might or monumental architecture. It is in the threads they wove between nations. The empire's satrapy system, dividing territory into semi-autonomous provinces governed by satraps, became a blueprint for large-scale governance. Roads like the Royal Road stitched together cultures and markets, allowing goods, ideas, and even languages to flow freely. Long before the term globalization existed, Persia was living it. And unlike many conquerors of history, the Persians often embraced the customs and religions of the peoples they ruled. Cyrus the Great famously allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a gesture that won him a place not only in political history, but in religious texts. This policy of tolerance was not born from weakness, but from a recognition that unity was forged not through fear alone, but through respect. Of course, the empire had its flaws. Corruption festered in distant satrapies, rebellions simmered when central authority faltered, and the glittering wealth of Persepolis drew envy as much as admiration. But even in defeat, Persia's cultural and political DNA seeped into the conquerors who toppled it. Alexander the Great, after crushing the Persian army at Gaugamela, adopted Persian court customs and even wore their robes. The Roman Empire, often seen as the heir to the Hellenistic world, borrowed heavily from Persian systems of roads, provincial governance, and even certain military logistics. Fast forward to the present, and echoes of Persia still ripple through modern governance, architecture, and art. The great domes and vaulted halls seen in Islamic architecture trace lineage back to Achaemenid design. Concepts of administrative division, taxation, and standardized currency, all refined under Persian rule, remain foundational to statecraft today. Even the very idea of a multi-ethnic empire bound by shared infrastructure rather than uniform ethnicity was a Persian innovation. If we pivot briefly to Age of Empires too, the Persian civilization mirrors this legacy. In the game, they're built for the long haul. Powerful economies, resilient structures, and devastating late-game military units. AoE2 Persian players often play a long, strategic match, building up until they can unleash war elephants and cavalry that dominate the field. It's a nod to history. Persia may have started as a desert tribe, but once fully built, they became a force capable of overwhelming empires. And just like in history, if you let them reach their full potential, it's already too late. As the light fades over Persepolis, you can almost see the empire as it once was. Caravans arriving at sunset, immortals standing guard at the gates. The hum of trade and diplomacy blending into the music of a living civilization. The wind picks up, stirring the dust from carved reliefs that have endured 2.5 millennia. They depict kings, soldiers, and subject peoples, not as enemies, but as contributors to a shared order. And that is perhaps the truest legacy of Persia. The vision that an empire could be more than a war machine. It could be a network, a bridge, a place where diversity was not erased, but integrated into a larger whole. It's a legacy that still challenges the modern world, asking whether strength is measured only in conquest or in the ability to weave together the strands of humanity into something greater than the sum of its parts. As we close this journey through the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, the stones of Persepolis remind us that power is fleeting, but vision can outlast empires. The Persians built not just for their time, but for the ages. And in that sense, they have never truly fallen. The question that lingers as the last light fades over the ruins is whether we will carry that torch forward or let the wind take it. History isn't just about the past, it's about the stories that shape our future. If you've enjoyed this journey through the rise and fall of the Persian Empire, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell, so you won't miss the next chapter in history's greatest sagas. Until then, keep the flame of curiosity burning, and I'll see you in the next story.